Good to see you here in Johannesburg.
Good to be on home soil.
I know a lot of things going on this year. This is a very significant BRICS Summit. Everything in juncture, as they say.
Absolutely. It's a good 10-year journey. The last time in Durban that we hosted a summit that was significant in the sense that the BRICS Business Council was initiated then. The idea of the bank was born then in 2013. And also it's significant from the perspective that we have 40 heads of state, the largest gathering of the BRICS Summit so far. So that is quite significant. And then secondly, I think you can feel the pulse that there's a strong momentum around BRICS. There's no question that BRICS is now becoming part of the permanent or has cemented its role as a permanent feature in the international governance system. What shape it will take, whether it will emerge as a complementary structure of the global south to the G20, for example, how exactly it will look, no one knows what the future holds.
To you, New Development Bank, of course, there is the topics to your heart. We all hear the leaders mention it once and again. Almost everybody has that in their speeches. So what do you say the reality role, New Development Bank as one that is on the horizon, still on its way to rise, can play at this point?
Absolutely. The bank is only 8 years old. In the life of an institution, it's still a very young institution. It's kind of a child becoming a teenager. However, there's strong interest in the bank, given that we have now approved 98 projects, $35 billion from a zero start. That progress was recognized by all the leaders, and they've complemented in particular the strong focus on sustainability, the commitment that the banks have made around climate finance, that 40% of all of our exposure in future will be in the climate arena. Secondly, all the presidents, including President Xi Jinping, specifically flagged the local currency financing aspect. As you know, we've been very active in the Chinese renminbi market. We have raised over 41 billion renminbi of bonds, and we're now trying to replicate that in the other currencies by also raising bonds in other markets like rupee, like South Africa.
Right. Rand this time the bond is doing very well, I heard, in the market, isn't it?
Absolutely. We're very excited about the fact that we were able to issue a bond a week before the summit. Exactly a week ago, the bank was able to raise 1.5 billion Rand on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. And importantly, we emphasize that the bank will become a regular issuer in the South African market, something which President Cyril Ramaphosa highlighted when he made his remarks.
And a lot of people are very excited about it because earlier it's mainly the RMB. Now we see very different varieties among local currencies of the BRICS economies.
Absolutely.
I'm sure you played a role too, as the Vice President of the New Development Bank, and your home turf too.
And also we are now in the final stages. I've just come from India 2.5 weeks ago, where we met the policymakers in Delhi, the regulators in Mumbai, and the bank is in the final stages of registering a rupee program in India, which will enable us to do the first issuance on Indian soil before end of 2023. So 2023 is therefore a very critical year for us, having done the first Rand issuance now and then also rupee issuance.
Talking about the international finance governance, one of the issues come to people's mind since we're having this conference on the African continent is the so-called African debt trap. As we know, statistics suggest, though, there is a different story. So as an economist yourself and someone coming from the African continent, how do you see these myths like this?
Africa is a rising continent. Africa is rich in minerals and commodities. It has the youngest population globally. It has a huge demographic dividend. By 2050, by the way, in 25 years from now, Africa will be bigger than China and India combined. These are incredible statistics. So Africa's got the ingredients for dynamic growth. However, it also has significant obstacles. So one of the obstacles is the fact that it's 54 countries, each with its own currency, each with its own regulatory framework. So there are significant obstacles to overcome, but there's a strong African interest in BRICS as well as in the bank. The majority of heads of state are in fact from Africa, and South African President Cyril Ramaphosa chose Africa as a key theme for this year's summit. We're hoping that a number of those countries will formally apply to join BRICS and then also formally apply to join the new development bank. As you just highlighted, unfortunately, a number of countries coming out of the COVID pandemic are facing fiscal distress. They have serious challenges from a debt servicing perspective that they need to overcome.
According to some of the latest official numbers, 3/4 of the African debt, of course, we're talking about many different countries and economies, they are having problems. Some don't actually, are coming from international institutions. And meanwhile, we are also seeing, according to ratio of the GDP, only 56% on average is the debt that African countries have toward their GDP ratio. Compared to that, developed economies, some can be much bigger proportion. So how do you see these more interesting data as they come out vis-a-vis the myth of the so-called African debt? It seems that they're suggesting every African country is in heavy debt and they will not be able to pay it and they have big problems. So how do you see this very different picture, in fact?
I think a couple of fundamentals need to be flagged. Firstly, it's important to recognize that provided that the country has got significant economic growth, it is generating the tax base to be able to service debt. If an economy is not growing or in recession and there's no growth at all, it becomes very difficult to service your debt because your interest payments keep on going up and your income, meaning your tax base, is actually going down. Fortunately, Africa is actually one of the fastest growing continents in the world. Asia is officially the fastest growing, but some of the fastest growing countries in the world are indeed in Africa, growing at 7, 8, in some cases 10%. So it's kind of a mixed story. There are challenges in Africa, but significant opportunities. Most of the commodities, for example, that go into iPhones and goes into the production of the technological devices, cobalt, for example, lithium, that goes into cell phones. Those minerals come from here, come from Africa, but we do not have the value chains, we do not have the industrial capacity to add value to these minerals. We export raw minerals and the benefits don't really derive back to Africa.
Right. As you may remember very well, recently these discussions is about whether it's just infrastructure or actually Africa needs not only infrastructure, but also different types of industrialization.
Exactly.
Now, if it is the latter, it needs even more different kinds of funding. What does that mean for funding? Not only bilaterally, but also multilaterally. How is this related to the big challenge of possible debt for the future? How does that work?
That's a very interesting question, Tian, because it hits the sort of the hammer on the nail. Essentially, we as a bank, other multilateral institutions also, we no longer want to finance individual projects because we want to look at ways to scale our impact. One way to scale your impact is to look at value chains across an industry. We don't just want to build a solar project, a wind farm or a solar project. We want to build a solar park in the desert where you can build massive solar parks. Indeed. Potentially. I visited, in Mongolia, the Kubuchi Desert, and I saw this massive solar project, and it's just so invigorating to see in the middle of what is just barren terrain, you can have a big economic asset like that. Africa has got the Sahara Desert, for example. Yes. We have the capacity Indeed. To produce power for the whole of Europe if we get our act together.
If things are done right.
If things are done right. So I agree fully with you that creating industrial chains, having proper industrial strategies in place. And I would argue also it's important to put in place green manufacturing, meaning not just manufacture any goods here in Africa, right. but look at goods that are green, that are sustainable, because then we can export those goods into all the markets throughout the world. In future, as you might know, a lot of countries will limit goods that are coming into their countries with too much carbon intensity.
But that also creates some interesting question marks as to how that will be done, because as you said, massive parks like that, it requires massive financing.
Exactly.
So how to make sure that could be done?
The multilateral banks have pledged that we do not want to be financing projects ourselves as a starting point.
Right.
We want to be looking at co-financing models, not just amongst ourselves, between, let's say, NDB and AIIB, as well as Asia Development Bank, European Investment Bank, World Bank. We want to be able to finance mega projects. And we can do that if we collaborate in more effective ways. So there's a discussion underway currently in the G20, which took place in Ahmedabad in Gujarat province in India, where the finance ministers met a few weeks ago. And there's a report that the heads of state of the G20 will discuss in September, which is exactly focused on this. How can we reform MDBs? How can we reform the entire vision, operating mission of multilateral banks to no longer fund individual projects, but to look at portfolios of projects and look at collaboration across an industry. So there's reform in the making as we speak.
During the summit, we heard from President Ramaphosa that the finance ministers need to work hard in future meetings in order to figure out how, either BRICS currency or local currency, how they will work. So you have been participating in the meeting in Cape Town among the finance ministers and financial officials coming from the BRICS countries. What are likely to be the mechanism in the future to discuss these crucial issues? What's likely to be the pace and the preferred pace that you would like to have as an official coming from the New Development Bank?
So there's full agreement that the bank has to aim and target for 30% of all of our annual lending volumes to be in local currency. We are already very effective in China, having established our name in the panda bond market in renminbi. We have now established that, as I mentioned, in South Africa. We've got a 10 billion rand program, and we're about to establish a $2.5 billion program in India. So the ingredients are there for us to make increasing use of local currency and for countries to trade more in their own currencies. That is very different from a BRICS currency. The notion of a BRICS currency is a more aspirational, long-term endeavor. No one has spoken about a BRICS currency in the official meetings with President Xi Jinping, Prime Minister Modi, Prime Minister Ramaphosa. All of them have emphasized the use of local currency because we do have strong capital markets in each of our member countries. What we're saying is we want to deepen those capital markets, make them more efficient, raise money in rand so that we can remove the foreign exchange risks when our currencies depreciate. So that's where the commitment comes from.
Leslie, among the BRICS economies, China certainly is one of the biggest to shape. Now, the Chinese economy is also facing a set of different challenges. So as someone working for the New Development Bank, China is 1/5 of that. So how do you see the realities of the Chinese economy?
Firstly, as a bank, there is very strong demand for further rollout of infrastructure in China. The slowdown of the Chinese economy does not in any direct manner impact on the New Development Bank. When I look at it as an economist, it was very clear over the last number of years that China was never going to be able to sustain the very high rates of nominal growth that China has had, coming out of the last 3 decades of reform and opening up. Growth was always going to slow down. But it is clear now that the focus is on high quality growth. The focus is on more inclusive growth. It's about increasing the sustainability of the growth, reducing the rural-urban divide in China, for example. Much bigger focus on Western China, where the infrastructure is still weak, because the eastern corridor of China is very developed. All the coastal cities, Shenzhen, Shanghai, all of these are very, very developed. So there's a change in the growth pattern in China, but the productive base of China is still very robust. Growth is slowing down, but it is still the biggest exporter in the world. It is the biggest manufacturer of just about everything that the rest of the world consumes. China have this big challenge now to reduce the carbon intensity of its big industries like steel, the sort of dirty industries, if you like, and that is probably also going to impact on growth because it now needs to move away and design new industrial processes that are green and sustainable. More green hydrogen fuel, for example, moving away from normal fossil fuels.
The other thing that the BRICS leaders mention in their speeches repeatedly is inequality and poverty. Now, we know that is a thing facing developing countries, emerging economies. In fact, also the global north in different parts of that space. So how do you see financing will be able to, of certain support, the role of the New Development Bank to establish role models?
I think development banks, as you know, are going through a revision of their mission statements. The World Bank, for example, had poverty alleviation as its core mandate, poverty alleviation and boosting what they call shared prosperity. They are now infusing climate change or the sustainability aspect into that vision. Listening to the heads of state today, it's very clear. And coming out of COVID, a lot of poverty statistics have worsened, unfortunately. We are not making as much progress as we would have liked to have made to meet the Sustainable Development Goals of 2030. In fact, we probably have gone backwards in a number of instances. So it is correct for the heads of state to re-emphasize that government programs have to be dedicated more towards the poverty alleviation agenda, and especially to remove extreme poverty.